March 18, 1980, 5:47 p.m. John Favara was driving home from work, same route he'd taken for 8 years through the quiet streets of Howard Beach, Queens. He turned onto 157th Avenue doing 25 in a neighborhood where kids played stickball until dark. That's when 12-year-old Frank Gotti darted between two parked cars on his minibike directly into Favara's path. The impact threw the boy 30 feet. Frank Gotti died instantly. John Favara, a furniture salesman and neighbor, had just killed the youngest son of John Gotti, rising captain in the Gambino crime family. What happened next would reveal something about power that even seasoned FBI agents had never witnessed. This wasn't about territorial disputes or business rivalries. This was about a father's grief transformed into something that made federal investigators realize they weren't just tracking another mobster, they were studying someone who couldn't separate the personal from the institutional, someone whose emotional responses became organizational policy. The 1980 New York that Frank Gotti died in was a city learning to live with institutional breakdown. Police response times in Queens averaged 47 minutes. Federal oversight of organized crime was reactive, not preventive. Neighborhoods like Howard Beach existed in spaces where informal authority often filled gaps that formal systems couldn't address. John Gotti understood these gaps better than most. By March 1980, Gotti had spent 2 decades building influence within the Gambino family's structure. He controlled crew operations at JFK Airport, managed significant loan sharking territories, and had earned respect through calculated demonstrations of resolve. But Gotti differed from traditional organized crime figures in one crucial way. He refused to compartmentalize his roles. Where others maintained clear boundaries between family man and criminal operator, Gotti allowed these identities to merge. The accident occurred on a Tuesday. Frank had been riding the minibike his father bought him for his birthday, practicing turns in the same neighborhood where John Gotti had grown up, where his own children played the same games he remembered. Favara never saw the boy coming. The police report was straightforward: accidental death, no criminal charges recommended. John Favara was devastated. He'd lived 4 houses down from the Gottis for almost a decade, knew Frank by name, had watched him grow up. But in Howard Beach, proximity created complications. Favara wasn't some anonymous driver who could disappear into the city's 8 million residents. He was the neighbor who sold furniture at Castro Convertibles, who borrowed tools from other fathers on the block, who'd have to continue living 30 yards from the grieving family of the child he'd killed. The mathematics of small communities don't accommodate certain types of tragedy. Victoria Gotti, Frank's mother, was inconsolable. Neighbors watched her scream at Favara's house, watched her throw rocks at his windows, watched her collapse on his front lawn, demanding answers that accidents don't provide. John Gotti's response was more controlled, more calculating. He attended his son's funeral with the same composed demeanor he brought to business meetings. FBI surveillance photographs from that week show a man whose grief had crystallized into something else entirely. The first sign that this wouldn't follow normal patterns came 3 weeks after the funeral. Favara attempted to visit the Gotti house, carrying flowers and a letter of condolence he'd written to Victoria. He never made it to the front door. Gotti's associates intercepted him at the curb, examined the letter, confiscated the flowers. The message was clear. Proximity had ended. Whatever relationship existed between neighbors was now void. Favara began receiving phone calls, never threats, never explicit language that could trigger police involvement, just reminders about what had happened, questions about his continued residence in the neighborhood, suggestions that other locations might prove more comfortable. The caller always identified himself as a friend concerned about community harmony. Favara understood the subtext. Local police discouraged Favara from filing complaints. This wasn't official policy, but practical reality. The 106th Precinct had learned through experience that certain disputes required careful navigation. Open confrontation with organized crime figures typically escalated problems rather than resolving them. Better to encourage private solutions, voluntary relocations, outcomes that avoided formal procedures everyone understood wouldn't succeed anyway. May 1980. Favara listed his house for sale. He'd lived there longer than most residents, had invested in improvements, genuinely liked the neighborhood. But community dynamics had shifted. Former friends stopped acknowledging him at the grocery store. His wife received silent treatment at parent-teacher conferences. Children were forbidden from playing in his yard. Howard Beach was teaching John Favara what exile looked like in miniature. The house sold quickly, below market value. Favara accepted the loss, calculated the cost of staying versus leaving, made the rational choice. He planned to move to New Jersey, restart his career, find a community where his connection to Frank Gotti's death wouldn't define his existence. The closing was scheduled for July 28, 1980. John Favara would never see that date. July 25, 1980, 3:15 p.m. Favara left Castro Convertibles after completing his shift, walked to his car in the employee parking lot behind the showroom. Witnesses reported seeing two men approach him near his vehicle, reported what appeared to be a brief conversation, reported Favara getting into a different car voluntarily. His own car was found unlocked, keys on the seat, wallet in the glove compartment. The missing person report generated minimal police interest. Favara was an adult, had been planning to leave the area anyway, showed no signs of mental instability or financial desperation. His disappearance aligned with his stated intentions to start fresh elsewhere. Detective work focused on standard explanations: voluntary departure, nervous breakdown, family crisis requiring immediate attention. But FBI agents monitoring Gotti's activities recognized different patterns. Their surveillance had documented the systematic isolation of Favara, the community pressure, the economic harassment. They'd observed Gotti's associates questioning Favara's co-workers, visiting his mortgage company, creating administrative complications for someone trying to complete a simple house sale. This wasn't random criminal activity. This was methodical demonstration of reach. What disturbed federal investigators wasn't the suspected violence. They'd tracked dozens of organized crime figures who'd ordered killings for business purposes. What they'd never seen was someone who'd transformed personal grief into institutional policy, who'd mobilized criminal infrastructure to address private emotional needs. Traditional mob bosses compartmentalized, Gotti integrated. The Favara disappearance sent signals throughout organized crime networks that even experienced criminals found unsettling. Business killings followed logical patterns: eliminate threats, silence witnesses, protect operations. But Favara posed no criminal threat. He'd committed no offense beyond the accidental killing of a child, something any parent driving any street could theoretically experience. If John Gotti would utilize family resources for personal revenge, what boundaries existed around his decision-making? August 1980. FBI surveillance reports began reflecting new assessment protocols for Gotti investigation. Previous analysis had categorized him as ambitious but predictable, someone whose behavior could be anticipated through standard organized crime frameworks. The Favara case suggested different psychological patterns: someone whose emotional responses bypassed traditional cost-benefit calculations, someone who'd sacrifice operational security for personal satisfaction. This realization shifted federal strategy. Agents who'd been tracking Gotti as a rising business criminal began studying him as something more complex and potentially more dangerous, Someone who couldn't separate family trauma from organizational policy couldn't be managed through conventional law enforcement approaches. His reactions couldn't be predicted using normal behavioral models. September 1980, Favara's wife received a single phone call from someone identifying himself as her husband. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Favara allegedly explained that he'd decided to disappear permanently, that continuing his previous life had become impossible, that she should consider him dead. The call ended abruptly. Phone records showed it originated from a location outside New York City, but specific tracing proved impossible. Whether John Favara died on July 25th or survived in permanent exile remains unknown. What's certain is that his disappearance established John Gotti as someone who'd transformed the basic rules of neighborhood existence. In Howard Beach, accidents involving certain families now carried consequences that extended beyond insurance claims and grief counseling. The community had learned to factor different mathematics into everyday decisions. This lesson resonated beyond Queens. FBI behavioral analysts studying the case identified Gotti as someone whose future actions couldn't be predicted through traditional criminal psychology. Someone who'd mobilize institutional resources for personal emotional needs represented a different category of threat. Someone who'd eliminated his son's accidental killer suggested he'd eliminate anyone whose actions caused him personal pain. The investigation files from 1980 show federal agents beginning to understand that John Gotti represented something unprecedented in their experience. Not a businessman who occasionally used violence, not a traditional crime family operator who maintained clear boundaries between personal and professional concerns. Someone who'd merged these categories completely, someone whose grief had become policy, someone whose emotional responses had institutional consequences. John Favara's disappearance marked the beginning of a different kind of federal surveillance. Agents realized they weren't just tracking another organized crime figure's rise through family hierarchy. They were documenting someone whose personal pain had evolved into organizational methodology, someone who demonstrated that in Howard Beach certain accidents carried costs that extended far beyond what any insurance policy could calculate. This was power without boundaries, grief without limitations, consequences without appeal. This was John Gotti teaching his community that some fathers don't accept accidents as explanations, don't recognize distinction between personal loss and institutional response, don't separate private grief from public demonstration. Frank Gotti died at 12 years old in an accident that could have happened anywhere, but it happened in Howard Beach to John Gotti's son in a neighborhood where proximity meant accountability, where grief could become policy, where a father's pain could rearrange the basic rules of community existence. The FBI finally understood what they were tracking.